Hello. Hello and welcome to everyone. My name is Fionnuala Croker. I'm the head of media at the European Parliament's office here in Dublin. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you to be here on behalf of our office and of the Parliament's office in London. Today's discussion is prompted by the award of the 2021 Sakharov Prize for Freedom and Thought to Alexei Navalny. An award ceremony took place in Strasbourg in December, at which he was represented by his daughter Daria and a friend and political advisor as well, as he was unavailable as he's in prison. The Sakharov Prize is the highest award, the highest recognition at EU level of human rights activities. It started in 1988 when it was awarded to Nelson Mandela and Anatoly Marchenko, also, like Navalny, a Russian dissident. It was named after Russian physicist Andrei Sakharov, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1975. As well as dissidents, previous winners include political activists, writers, opposition, journalists, lawyers, writers, mothers, wives, peace activists, and even a cartoonist. As well as an endowment, the prize helps provide publicity and practical support to laureates. Several laureates have gone on subsequently to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Today, we're joined by four very eminent speakers who have a range of experience in fields relevant to the discussion, and by an equally eminent chair. Our moderator, Pat Leahy of the Irish Times, will introduce our panel. It just remains for me to warmly thank our panellists here today, Barry, Sinéad, Caoilfhionn and Maria online. Thank you to our colleague here in Dublin, Jeremy O'Sullivan, for creating today's event. And thank you for being here and for watching online. Over to you, Pat.
Thanks. All right, give her a round of applause. Thanks, Fionnuala, and thank you all for being here. Fionnuala was very generous. I'd have settled for slightly less eminent than the speakers, but I'll go with equally. Let me reprise what Fionnuala said and say a couple of words about the Sakharov Prize and its importance. It's for individuals or groups who have dedicated their lives to the defence of human rights and of freedom of thought, and it's dedicated to the memory of Andrei Sakharov. And it's worth, I think, pausing for a moment to recall why the European Parliament chose to memorialise this man. Sakharov was one of the most important scientists in the Soviet Union and was central to its programme of developing nuclear weapons in the 1950s. And as such, he enjoyed all the privileges and status that his country could bestow. And he could have continued to live his life under the protection and security of the Soviet regime. But he chose a different path. He spoke out against the human rights abuses of the communist dictatorship, becoming perhaps the best known dissident in the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s, agitating for human rights in Russia, maintaining foreign links, and speaking out against the many atrocities of the regime. He was eventually sent to an internal exile and undertook several hunger strikes before being released when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. This year's recipient of the Sakharov Award is Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader. And his resistance to the regime of Vladimir Putin mirrors that of his compatriot Sakharov to the earlier Russian totalitarianism. He has survived an assassination attempt, and having returned to Russia to fight for the future of his country, he was imprisoned by the regime, and in recent weeks he has been transferred to a maximum security penal colony. And it's to honour these men and to discuss this tradition, this bravery and sacrifice, that we come together today to discuss the question, is it possible to live an honest life under a dishonest political system? Our panel is Barry Andrews MEP, Maria Logan, who will be joining us online from the Open Russia Foundation, Sinéad Gibney from the Irish Human Rights Commission, and Caoilfhionn Gallagher, who is a human rights lawyer from Doughty Street Chambers in London. We will take their contributions first, and then I hope we'll have time for questions and to the panel and a discussion amongst the audience. So without further ado, I will invite our first speaker. Barry Andrews is an Irish politician who serves as a member of the European Parliament for the Dublin constituency. He was previously a Minister of State for Children from 2008 to 2011, and was a TD for the Dún Laoghaire constituency from 2002 to 2011. His biography, helpfully supplied by his office, says that Barry believes in Europe. And I think I speak for us all when I say that Europe also believes in Barry. So, Barry.
Yes, so when you disclosed that I wrote the introduction, it's not quite as flattering as it might otherwise have been. But look, thank you, Pat. Really great to be here this afternoon to mark the bravery of Alexei Navalny, which speaks for itself, his actions and the courageous steps that he's taken, really beyond anything I can appreciate or understand. But the European Parliament was delighted to award him the Sakharov Prize, and I'm very proud to be associated with that. So I'm going to use the time available to outline how the dilemma described in the title of today's event is not confined to totalitarian states like Russia, but can be found much closer to home in much less brazen but insidious form. In the UK, the stigma against breaking international law, domestic law, and constitutional norms has been significantly eroded under the Prime Ministership of Boris Johnson. It poses serious difficulties for honest, decent UK officials who are asked to repeat lines to take that are circulated by the Foreign Office and mostly by Number 10, in circumstances where those lines are misleading, nakedly political, and in some cases even illegal. We live in an era that has been described as a democratic recession. The Economist Intelligence Unit reported earlier this year that only 46% of people live in a democracy of some sort. 7%, just 7% live in full democracies, which is an astonishing figure in 2022. Likewise, Freedom House reported last year that there has been 16 consecutive years of decline in global freedom. In other words, this pattern of decline records the fact that many of the countries that rank as autocracies, or at least not a full democracy, have seen freedoms eroded gradually and insidiously. It's like the answer to the question, how did you become bankrupt? In two ways, gradually and then suddenly. And that is why it is of utmost importance to call out these trends at the earliest possible time. Democracy is not like some heirloom that is handed down from one generation to the next. It is something that has to be earned afresh by each new generation. This is also why the European Commission's equivocal approach to brazen breaches of the rule of law by the Polish and Hungarian governments also needs to be called out. Let's have a quick look, if you don't mind, at the charge sheet against the UK government. The most obvious and brazen example was the attempt to prorogue Parliament before being stopped by the UK Supreme Court, which found that, quote, it was unlawful to frustrate or prevent Parliament from carrying out its constitutional functions, unquote. The fact that this needed to be pointed out by the highest court in the land to the government in itself is truly astonishing. But the instinct to bypass constitutional safeguards didn't end with the findings of the UK Supreme Court. Earlier this year, the Dissolution and Calling of Parliament Act was passed, which prevents courts from making certain rulings in relation to a government's power to dissolve Parliament. A second well-known example is the Internal Market Bill, proposed by the UK government in September 2020, which, as we know, was sought to disapply elements of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And just to be clear, Article 4 of the international treaty that contains the protocol clearly states the provisions of the withdrawal agreement take precedence over anything in domestic UK law. That is why, with surprising candor, the Minister, Brandon Lewis, admitted that the provisions were breaking international law in a specific and limited way. The government eventually stepped back from this position, but not before the resignation of the UK's top law officer, Jonathan Jones. As Professor Philippe Sands of UCL said, it raised serious questions about the UK's commitment to the rule of law And he said, and I quote, "The UK abroad has been renowned for proceeding very carefully. Their respect for a country that I've looked up to in its commitment to the rule of law is crumbling," unquote. And this brings us to the third example, which is the current protocol bill, which passed second stage in the House of Commons last Monday. Again, the purpose was to disapply parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol. The same Jonathan Jones, writing for the House website, described this bill as even more brazen than the UK Internal Market Bill and noted, and I quote, that the UK has shown the world that it is prepared to walk away from important treaty obligations on the flimsiest of pretexts, unquote. The flimsy pretext in this context was the assertion of the doctrine of necessity, although no legal advice to back this up is available. The International Law Commission says that the assertion of the doctrine of necessity requires that the state is safeguarding an essential interest against a grave and imminent peril. If it is being asserted to address an imminent danger, it makes it baffling that the UK government opted for legislation that take a year to get through Parliament. There are numerous other examples: unilateral extensions of grace periods, several threats to trigger Article 16, and there are some breaches of international norms that are not related to the UK's relation to the EU. Johnson imposed a 3-line whip on his MPs to overturn a recommendation of the Parliament's own Committee on Ethical Standards. His own ethical advisor has recently resigned. He plans to weaken the role of the Independent Electoral Commission in the UK. He has constrained the right to move a judicial review proceeding. And there are, unfortunately, many other examples. I just wanted to make that point at the beginning to re-establish the idea that we have to identify the erosion of democracy and human rights at the earliest phase, because this is a slow process of gradual decline across the world. And I think it's worth pointing that out in regard to our nearest neighbour. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry.
Let me just take up just one or 2 points on that. And obviously, you're in Brussels and Strasbourg now, but you're somebody with long political experience in the Irish government. I mean, how should the Irish government seek to coexist honestly with this dishonest political system next door, this emerging dishonesty that's at the heart of the current government in the neighbouring jurisdiction? Because, I mean, it's not like the Irish government is a disinterested observer in what is happening in the United Kingdom. Aside altogether from, geographic proximity, there's the, not unimportant issue of the North. So how should the Irish government try to live honestly with this?
Well, the Irish government, I'm not the Irish government, I'm a member of the European Parliament, and I'm an Anglophile, very, very much an Anglophile, and I'm absolutely committed to the idea of the EU-UK relationship moving away from rivalry to partnership. There's so much more to do. We have exactly the same interest. We have the same strategic threat analysis about Ukraine, 100% the same on climate, and yet we are held back by an intellectually dishonest position on Northern Ireland. But the Irish government will take, I think, will be sensible enough to know that it is up to the UK to correct these issues themselves. It's not for us to correct them. If we point them out, that's a different thing. But we've had resignation, not just Jonathan Jones, of Alexander Hall, who was the Brexit councillor in Washington. Sir Ivan Rogers resigned. There are lots of UK officials that have stepped down because they weren't prepared to put up with this. But the Irish government's position is simply to try to allow the UK system to work this out, because there's nothing that we can do except point it out.
Is the Irish government in a stronger position than the Commission or some of the other member states to speak truth to neighbouring power?
I don't know. You'd like to think so, because I think in the last 20 years, since the Good Friday Agreement in particular, Ireland and the UK have gone through a golden age of relationships, from the visit of the Queen to Ireland, the visit of the President to the UK. It really is a remarkable thing that was completely unhorsed by Brexit. And it has been in decline ever since that, unfortunately, and it is now at a low point. However, you need to speak truth to power. It's just what you have to do, and friends have to do it. And I think Ireland and Britain, our people are as close as they've ever been. But our governments, I think they have to be frank with each other. And the Irish government, will they get a better hearing than Brussels? I think we probably consume British media day in, day out in a way that isn't done in any other third country, if you want to call it, outside the UK. And so we probably appreciate the nuances more. And maybe I'm not answering the question fully, but doing my best.
You're slightly avoiding it, you know, but we let you away with that for the time being. Anyway, perhaps it's an issue to which we'll return in the discussion at the end. But I want to move on to our next speaker, the technology allowing, I'm delighted to say, is Maria Logan from the Open Russia Foundation and trustee to the Future of Russia Foundation and the Khodorkovsky Foundation. Maria is a native of St. Petersburg in Russia. In 2008, she joined the worldwide campaign for the release of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and subsequent to his release, she joined the Open Russia movement. Open Russia seeks to provide a platform for Russians living both inside and outside of Russia who are committed to Euro-Atlantic values based on a strong, dynamic, and forward-looking state with effective democratic institutions and the rule of law. So, Maria, I'd like to welcome you, and please proceed.
Hello. Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly.
Oh, wonderful. So I cannot see anyone in the room, so I'm kind of looking at, okay, now it's better. At least I see your back.
Well, there's a crowd of about 5,000 here. They fill the oak-panelled halls of this ancient building. And there's a crowd outside in the street, and your words are being relayed to them as we speak. So please.
You know, I have to say, I love the sense of humor in Dublin because the topic is pretty grim. Anyway, so yeah, jumping from UK and Northern Ireland and Ireland into Russia. So I was asked to contribute to sort of the discussion about this topic, but from the perspective of someone who grew up in Russia and who also follows up Russia very closely. So I haven't lived in Russia for 20 years. So it's been sort of US, UK, but I continue to work on Russian issues and especially work with civil society in Russia. So the three organizations that I mentioned sort of in the bio, all of them are now on the list of so-called undesirable organizations inside Russia. So last year, all these three organizations were added to the list of, Open Society, Institute of, European Endowment for Democracy, and a few other good organizations that support democracy around the world. And in terms of the consequences, for Russian citizens to work together with undesirable organizations is at the moment is 6 years in prison. So happy to be on the list, but for those of people who used to be our partners in Russia, it has become more dangerous to work with us. So I on this philosophical question in the title. So I called my father yesterday, who is currently in Russia. He lives in Antwerp, but he's right now inside Russia in St. Petersburg. And I asked him this question, and his answer was, you can certainly live an honest life as a private citizen in private life, but in Russia today, which is, I wouldn't categorize it as just a dishonest political system. I mean, it's simply a dictatorship at the moment. So in Russia, living an honest life publicly is impossible anymore. So at the start of the war, since February 24th, there are over 300,000. I mean, nobody knows exactly, but that's sort of the estimate at the moment. Over 300,000 people, Russian citizens who left Russia. I mean, that's, can be compared with the Ukrainians that's been displaced in the millions since the start of the war. But nevertheless, these are the most active, the most pro-European, the most educated Russians who left since the start of the war. And the simple reason for that is because they left in protest to the war they can no longer protest the war. It's harder for them to protest the war publicly inside Russia, and I will talk a little bit about that. So they all left. So they're now in Europe. They go wherever they can go. If they have a visa to European Union, they come to EU. If they have a visa to US, they go there. But most of them don't have the visa, so they are now living in hotels and B&Bs with friends or relatives in Tbilisi, in Yerevan, in Tashkent, and in Istanbul. So there is an influx of very talented Russians there, and they all united with an idea of that Putin regime, has done this, aggression against Ukraine, and they don't feel themselves like they can live in the country where they cannot speak against it. So for those Russians that are left, there are different figures in terms of support of the war. So there's anywhere between 30 to 40% of Russians do support the war, or some sort of form of aggression against Ukraine. Some of them have been under the spell of the very successful propaganda machine that's been going on for a decade inside Russia, if not more. There's some Russian people who are sort of in between, who don't take sides either because of the fear of speaking out or because they just don't know where the truth is. And then there are also people who are still against the war, against the regime, who speak out. It's become very dangerous to do, but they do speak out. There's been protests on the streets, especially at the beginning, less so now. They speak out even knowing that, in Russia, there is a new law since the start of the war, which basically can put you to prison from 5 to 10 years for, as they call, spreading disinformation about the military forces and military operations, which in practical term means you cannot call the war in Ukraine a war, you can only call it special operation, and similar things that if you talk about against this war and aggression, you can essentially go to prison for 10 years. There's a lot of fear inside Russia among people, even in private life, this sort of the fear of people snitching on you or snitching on their neighbors is back. So remember, I don't remember the Soviet time in the 70s, because I was only born in 74. But our parents do remember this, when you're careful about what you say in public or what you say among your friends and neighbors. So that feeling is back. People are afraid. And a few of those who are brave enough to speak out, they go to prison. So since the start of the war, there have been 50 cases filed, criminal cases against people who speak against the war. The most prominent one of them are Vladimir Karamurza, who've been charged with this new article of spreading disinformation about the war. There's a few other activists there's one in particular, Alexandra, I forgot her last name, but she's an artist, and she was replacing price tags in the supermarkets with the anti-war information. So she's in detention right now, and she's facing up to 10 years in prison as well. So to wrap up this kind of short intervention, it's people who want to speak publicly and be honest with themselves about what they see and what they feel. They either find themselves in prison or they have to leave, and there's a lot of them leaving, and more people will be leaving. Not a very optimistic, unfortunately, picture right now.
Maria, thanks so much for that. Let me follow up with one or two questions. I mean, you spoke about how the sheer numbers of Russians who have been forced abroad because of the strictures of the Putin regime. I mean, how important a force do you think they are in domestic Russian politics in the broadest sense? And how important on the ground in Russia is international pressure?
So on your first question, so we support projects at the moment that are designed to support those Russians who left. So, and it doesn't matter who these Russian citizens are, whether they are political activists, human rights defenders, or just simple citizens who left in protest of the war. So they're very important in our view because, and they need support because they're the force who can come back to Russia and communicate, if there is a chance to the Russian society when there is a chance of change. And we feel that there is a possibility that that will come in the next, 2 to 5, 7 years. So it's important to help these people now. They're the most active, the most, pro-European ones. And if we help them, then they, later on, they will become those communicators, important communicators inside Russia to speak to the society. They're also an important component among those people that are leaving, and these are the bloggers, the journalists, as we call them, influencers inside Russia. So they're the ones who, at the moment, can continue to influence Russian society from outside. What I mean by this, there's media platforms, there are YouTube channels that they continue to run and speak to the Russian society from Europe, from here. And Russian society is listening to them. So some of these figures are very famous. They're celebrities inside Russia, sort of the Schwarzeneggers of Russia. And they find themselves right now in a difficult situation because when they come here, there's a tendency to accuse all Russians of and blame all Russians for the aggression. So it's not easy for them to operate from here, but nevertheless, they have the important Russian audience there, and they're listening to them. So in terms of the pressure, international pressure inside Russia, so it's people inside Russia consider the West to be the enemy number one. The Russian propaganda looks at the West as the aggressor and portraits the West as the aggressor in this conflict. They're saying it's the NATO, it's the Americans, it's the NATO that attacked Russia almost on the Ukrainian soil, and Russians had to go to Ukraine to defend itself, basically. I know it sounds like a completely different reality, but that's how it is viewed from inside Russia. For those Russians that are against the regime, either being quiet or even speaking out, for them, international pressure is extremely important because it works as a solidarity. They feel they're not alone inside Russia, that their view is being supported from outside. So it's extremely important to speak to that part of the Russian society from here, and keep in mind that not everyone is for aggression. There are people who are against the aggression, against the regime.
And just one further question, because you mentioned earlier, about the prospects for the future in 5, 6, 7 years and so forth. But if you cannot live a public life honestly in Russia at the moment without threat to your life and livelihood, that must disfigure public life. And I wonder, does that pass when Putin ceases to be in control, however that happens? Or has politics and public life become so corrupted there that a normal democracy isn't possible?
So at the moment, there is no political life. There is no real politics inside Russia. I mean, there's sort of, some sort of elections, municipal elections taking place, but you can't really believe that there is real elections taking place in Russia. So in terms of political life, it's non-existent now. But if Putin goes, there will be a chance for that to come back, and people will come back from their sort of, private life. I mean, it happened during the Soviet Union, as perestroika started, all of a sudden there was a new fresh air around everyone. People started to speak out more and more and more and more because it was encouraged. I mean, before nobody would dare discuss political issues, as I mentioned before, for fear of, that someone will report to the police or to the KGB or FSB now. So, but it doesn't mean that people are not, they're just waiting, they're waiting for the moment where they feel it's much safer. At the moment, the risks are just too high for people to speak out. So I think it's going to happen, and may happen quicker than we all anticipate, like it happened, in the Soviet Union. It's just, in a few days, it was all over.
Okay, Maria, listen, thanks so much for your contribution. And I know you're staying with us, and I think we'll probably return to some of those themes in the Q&A session after the formal speeches. But for now, I'm going to turn to our next speaker. Sinéad Gibney is the Chief Commissioner of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. She was the inaugural director of the Commission between 2014 and 2016. And prior to that, she built and led Google Ireland's corporate social responsibility function called Social Action. She was once nearly an election campaign for the Social Democrats, and we never say never, I suppose, but about electoral life again. So Sinéad Gibney.
Thanks so much, Pat. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. I get a lot of requests to do talks, but rarely do I get the opportunity to respond to what is essentially a political philosophy thought experiment like this one that we're dealing with today. So thank you very much for inviting me to join the illustrious panel. And I thought a lot about how to shape my contribution today. I first started to pick apart the wording and approach it pedantically. And then I thought of the people that come to mind in asking this question: is it possible to live an honest life under a dishonest political system? And the people who came to my mind were dissidents and human rights defenders like Miriam Makeba, Pussy Riot, Malala Yousafzai, and of course, the man we celebrate today, Alexei Navalny. And all of these people resisted or continue to resist oppression and indeed the dishonest political systems that they live in the name of freedom of thought. The obvious place for me to go to is probably rule of law. Justice and rule of law is one of the priorities of the new strategy of the organisation that I lead, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. And it's a topic that I'm called to speak on more and more these days, which I think is a signal of the fragility that it is in at the moment. I even thought about using the analogy of Love Island, and I'm going to gauge the response of the audience by how many people I'm about to lose, but bear with me, because really this is a place where dishonest producers tinker with the political system and rules that govern the islanders' lives. They feed them disinformation, they shift the goalposts, and it's a situation in which those who hold true to their honesty, their authenticity, they seem to emerge out of the experience with the least scars and possibly a shot at the loot. And as I've been mulling it over the last few weeks, and I've really enjoyed mulling it over, I have to say, but the question seems to be relevant to so many current situations. What's happening now in the US Supreme Court, the disregard for rule of law currently being demonstrated by our nearest neighbours, and which Barry so helpfully detailed for us. The misuse of emergency powers globally throughout the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, they all demonstrate the fragility of democracy and our systems of government. And I keep coming back to the same question in response to it. Is there any such thing as an honest political system? Because from legitimate dishonesty like gerrymandering and filibustering to corrupt dishonesty like voter fraud and disinformation, probably the biggest threat that I would identify, it really is hard to identify any political system that can actually be described as fully honest. Rule of law is a pretty difficult concept to pin down, with differing interpretations depending on who you talk to. But most will agree that it's about transparency, the application of laws equally, separation of powers, judicial strength, and ultimately that nobody is above the law. But what rule of law does, in my understanding, is to keep in check those levels of system dishonesty enough to maintain the trust that is crucial for democracy to survive and sustain. And it's a term that I say is uttered more and more by an increasingly broader audience as we see it under increasing threat. And I also kept trying to come back to this question of the definition of what is an honest life. And I think Maria has very helpfully separated the public and private life, but I probably reflected more on the private life. And on this question, I believe that we can only truly answer that at an individual level. And I think it is something that we all must do. So what it means for me is self-growth. I personally have an honesty compulsion. I'm not only really bad at lying and hiding my feelings, I also have to name something if it's unsaid, the very many elephants I see in so very many rooms. And I've learned to harness that as a great strength. I strive to grow and remain self-aware, and I see every opportunity as a site of learning and an opportunity for growth. And I'm an unabashed optimist, which is why I think I'm such a huge fan of Alexei Navalny and his attitude to his life and to his work. At the very end of the BBC documentary Navalny, which I really urge you to watch if you haven't already done so, the interviewer asks Alexei what is his legacy message for the people of Russia. And it's a very touching moment because he is essentially asking that if his life is to end, what message is he going to leave behind? And I'm relying on the subtitle translation here as he is asked to, and he does respond in Russian. Listen, I've got something very obvious to tell you. You're not allowed to give up. If they decide to kill me, it means that we are incredibly strong. We need to utilize this power to not give up, to remember we are a huge power that is being oppressed by these bad dudes. We don't realize how strong we actually are. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. So don't do nothing. I think this gives us the answer we're looking for today. Yes, it is possible to live an honest life under a dishonest political system, often at a great price, as Navalny now embodies, but always for the greater good. Not only is it possible, it is crucial to live an honest life under the dishonest political systems that we all inhabit. In fact, living an honest life is the only true resistance of a dishonest political system, of corruption, of disinformation, and of the growing threats to democracy and rule of law that we are witnessing across our globe. Thank you.
Thanks, Sinéad. And it's correct, as you mentioned, that it is possible and maybe essential to live honestly under a dishonest system, but it is also something that is done that often at great personal cost to people. And ideally, you wouldn't get there. You wouldn't get to a dishonest system in the first place. So, I mean, you head up an important institution, and maybe it's the intervention of institutions in a system that, because of its human and democratic nature, may tend towards dishonesty. It's institutions that may keep it on the straight and narrow. That's more by way of being a point than a question. But I'll put a question mark at the end of it and ask you to comment on it.
Well, absolutely. I think national human rights institutions, which is what my organisation is, and a national equality body, we hold a very important role in monitoring the state in its equality and human rights activities and holding it to account under the obligations it holds at domestic and international level for human rights and equality. And one of the biggest barriers for us at the moment is data. The Irish state is poor at collecting, reporting and disseminating disaggregated data. And without that, we as a national human rights institution do not have a clear picture on the application of law, for example, across different groups. I was at a report launched last week which measured the experience of Irish travellers and their access to justice, and particularly with justice institutions like An Garda Síochána and the courts. And the starting point is one of very, very low trust. And I think it's really important to remember when you're hearing about those experiences that For many of us, we have a positive relationship with An Garda Síochána. For other communities, like travellers, for example, or young black men that I've spoken to, they feel very clearly that they are over-policed as suspects and under-policed as victims. So I think that's an example where without that data, without that information and knowledge, we don't have the opportunity to measure that rule of law within this country. And it's one of the biggest barriers that we experience.
And, you know, we are amongst the fortunate 7% that live in a full democracy. But as your work bears out, you know, we are far from perfect. So, but generally, where do you rate Ireland on the scale of, you know, being an honest society and an honest political system?
I'm not going to put it on a 1 to 10 scale.
Well, you can choose the numbers that you best fits.
I do think it's important to recognise, as you say, that we are in a progressive democracy. I mean, even the existence of our institution, for example, we are an A-accredited body which has the capacity to hold the government to account, and there are many other bodies like us in the state which do similar roles. But I think that data one probably is, for me, one of the biggest things that we need to push on and to remind people of. And disinformation similarly. So, for example, when we talk about COVID and the introduction of emergency powers have to be applied with a series of principles in mind: legality, proportionality, non-discrimination, and necessity. And what we saw with the COVID powers that were introduced, for example, was a tendency on the part of the Irish state to set beside each other what was guidance alongside what was law, with the result that there was a lot of confusion, a lot of, I would say, obfuscation on the part of the state. And that's an erosion of trust that people remember. And that's where we see it. And it's those examples, like, for example, the traveller experience with policing. Access to justice is another huge one. The application of law equally is only possible if we can all access justice equally. And unfortunately, here in Ireland, the access to legal aid, for example, civil legal aid, is just very poor. So people don't have that same equality. So for me, I think there are many areas in which equality can improve, and that will strengthen the rule of law. So I do think absolutely we are in a very privileged position compared to many other countries, but we have a huge amount to continue to work on.
Thanks a million. I'm going to turn to our final panel speaker now. Caoilfhionn Gallagher is a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers in London, where she specialises in human rights law. She's acted in many landmark cases in the UK in recent years, and internationally she has acted in significant human rights cases before the European Court of Human Rights and before UN bodies. She's acted for and secured the freedom of many arbitrarily detained journalists, cartoonists, cultural rights workers and human rights defenders around the world, including in Iran, Egypt, Tanzania, Saudi Arabia and Equatorial Guinea. She was also a near contemporary of mine in UCD, and had she only skipped more lectures and spent more time in the bar, she might have made it to the Irish Times rather than having to settle for being a Queen's Counsel. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Caoilfhionn Gallagher.
Thanks very much. Well, as you've heard, I'm visiting from London, fresh from Partygate, Tractorgate. More fundamentally, a situation where we have, as Barry's so powerfully described, a significant erosion of respect for the rule of law and respect for international law obligations. And I would second the charge sheet, which Barry outlined earlier, and indeed add some more of my own. We've also got currently the Prime Minister changing the ministerial code to save his own skin, a level of audacity. I can't compete with your Love Island analogy, probably a level of audacity and self-interest last seen by General Melchett in the trial of Captain Blackadder in the Speckled Jim case. But it's certainly a topic very close to home. So, and it's also a topic particularly close to home for me, just because many of my clients have been very connected to the Sakharov Prize in a number of ways, including the family of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta. And in fact, I've got here a tweet from Matthew Caruana Galizia, her eldest son, who's one of my clients, who in December 2017 posted on Twitter an incredibly poignant photograph of a notebook which he found at the site of the bomb blast which killed his mother she was carrying on the day she was killed with the Sakharov Prize on the front cover. And as many of you will know, the prize now founded by the European Parliament in relation to the memory of Daphne Caruana Galizia follows very closely in the footsteps of the Sakharov Prize, but with a specific focus on journalism. So that's rather a somber start. But I did want to start by saying, you heard the list earlier of laureates of the Sakharov Prize and just how broad they are, encompassing journalists, political dissidents, lawyers, civil society activists, writers, and indeed that one cartoonist. But the golden thread which runs through all of those individuals is the concept of speaking truth to power, despite very grave risks to them as individuals, to their safety, their security, their liberty, and often their lives. And Alexei Navalny, I'm very proud to be speaking about Alexei Navalny today. Many of you will recall at the time when he was arrested at Moscow airport, he'd returned from Germany, where he'd spent 5 months recovering from being poisoned with the nerve agent Novichok. And he returned to Russia knowing full well what faced him. When many others would and do speak truth to power in exile from abroad, he decided to return. And he decided to return knowing full well what faced him. Russian authorities indeed had broadcast on state TV and via state media for months the fate that would befall him when he returned, or if he returned, apparently in an attempt to scare him off. But scared off he was not. And he returned despite that. He also knew full well, given his background, precisely what conditions would face him in Russian prisons. And nevertheless, he returned. And he was very much in my mind in December last year when I was at my brave, indefatigable client, Maria Ressa's Nobel Prize ceremony in Oslo. So Maria Ressa, a brilliant woman and visionary, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize jointly with Dmitry Muratov from Russia. And after a number of days in a celebratory atmosphere in Oslo, they returned on planes to Russia and to the Philippines, respectively, on flights which, very similar to that flight that Alexei Navalny took, they knew they were returning to circumstances where they were at grave risk. And as you've seen, of course, with what's happened with Dmitry Muratov in the months since that ceremony, those fears were indeed realized. And many of you will have seen the news this week that even with the change of government in the Philippines, there are continuing attempts with the new regime to shut down Rappler, Maria Ressa's media organization in the Philippines. Now, I mention that because it seems to me that being a journalist in a country like Russia or a country like the Philippines is in itself an act of bravery. And Maria opened her Nobel Peace Prize speech in December by talking rather chillingly about the number of journalists who'd been killed under the Duterte regime. And many of you who followed that speech will have heard her give the number 22. What you won't know is that you have to submit your speech for the Nobel Peace Prize lecture a number of days in advance because it's got to be translated into so many different languages. It's quite difficult to change even the odd word. And on the Wednesday evening, when we were meeting in Oslo before the ceremony on the Friday morning, we had to write to say, I'm sorry, you're going to have to change it, because her speech had said 21 journalists had been killed under the Duterte regime in the 5 years since 2016. And in fact, we found out on the Wednesday evening that Jess Malaban, one of Maria's colleagues, former colleagues, had been shot dead that evening. And we had to say, you've got to up the number to 22. She did also mention in her speech that in that same time frame, 63 lawyers were killed in the Philippines. And that's a theme I want to return to in a moment. I appreciate a lawyer saying, won't someone think of the lawyers? It's possibly not the most attractive point, but I'll explain why that's quite important in a moment. I just wanted to touch on a number of trends, a very serious concern that I see in my cases internationally involving journalists and also involving opposition activists, peaceful protesters, and so on. So there's 3 trends I wanted to highlight. And then at the end, I do want to turn just very briefly to some points about the UK, picking up on what Barry said. So the first trend I wanted to highlight is what I would call lawfare, which is a weaponization of the law against those who speak truth to power. And that's what we've seen with Alexei Navalny. It's what we see in Maria Ressa's case, where she faces a lifetime behind bars simply for doing her job, for being a journalist. Or indeed today, on the anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong, my client Jimmy Lai is languishing in a Hong Kong prison, also facing a wide range of different misuses and abuses of the law in an attempt to silence and gag him. And the way I describe it really is, it's like a jurisprudential version of whack-a-mole. Used to be the case that acting for peaceful protesters or acting for journalists, you would have to face certain predictable legal threats, defamation laws, terrorism laws, sometimes sedition. But what's increasingly being used by many regimes is misusing other types of laws, things like fraud laws, copyright laws, intellectual property laws. Now, that's difficult in a number of ways, partly because as soon as someone hears about fraud or financial mismanagement, there's an element of no smoke without fire. Some people considering it too difficult to engage with. It's much easier to tell the story of a journalist who's being sued for cyber libel, or for criminal defamation, for writing a public interest story than it is to explain why an allegation that someone has fraudulently failed to pay tax, for example. It's much harder to tell that story in an attractive, simple way. It's also much harder to fight. So just very simply, many of the clients that I've got are living in non-rule of law compliant regimes. They've got lawyers who are frightened and lawyers who themselves are targeted simply for the act of defending individuals who are subjected to lawfare like this, and often simply for the very act of being a defense lawyer at all. But when you have a range of different laws being used, the person who's the target also needs to have a copyright expert, also needs to have a fraud expert. So it's much more difficult to fight just in very simple ways. And it's much more difficult to get the international community engaged when you've got a harder story to tell. The second trend I wanted to point out is, in many of my cases, I see a long-standing culture of impunity before you have an action which is described as a bolt from the blue or a surprise, when in fact it's not a bolt from the blue or a surprise. It's long been there, and thinking back to Barry's language at the start. So, for example, in many of my cases involving the deaths of journalists, it comes against a long-standing culture of impunity and a message which goes out from on high that journalists are fair game. So let me give you an example relatively close to home. When Daphne Caruana Galizia was assassinated brutally in October 2017, it was described by many as a bolt from the blue, as a terrible shock that here we are in a Council of Europe country, a European Union country, when this very well-known journalist, described as a one-woman WikiLeaks and as Malta's national conscience by various people, it was described as being utterly shocking and a bolt from the blue. And I'm afraid that's simply incorrect. She'd given a Council of Europe interview 10 days beforehand, where she set out in chilling detail the threats that she was under. She had been under threat from a wide range of sources. She'd faced misogynistic, sexist abuse online. She'd people spitting at her on the street. She had politicians who'd given quotes and written blogs about how she was a witch, for example, and circulated images online, distorted images which showed her in a grotesque way. And I'm afraid that was not only known by the Maltese public, it was also known across Europe. And close allies of Malta, including Ireland and including the UK, did not in fact call that out before Daphne was killed in October 2017. And I do think it's extremely important that we remember that when we see issues like this and a culture of impunity, we do what we can to call it out early and to take action. And I've been very pleased with much of the work that's been done on that issue by the Irish government in Geneva, for example, and in New York. And there's a particular opportunity for the Irish, given its role in the UN Security Council currently, to really show leadership on this topic, which is important. And last trend I wanted to point out is what I would call the long arm of the state. Now, we're talking about Alexei Navalny here, who returned to Russia despite the risks to him. But of course, what we've seen with Russia's actions over the last number of years is they're no longer satisfied with simply trying to silence their critics within their borders. They will take action across borders, including the use of nerve agents, including other attacks on individuals on foreign soil. We've seen stark examples of that with Jamal Khashoggi, for example, being attacked by Saudi Arabia and dismembered in Turkey. We've seen the very stark example of Roman Protasevich from Belarus having his Ryanair flight literally hijacked in order to bring him back within the state. And that's a trend which I'm increasingly seeing. And I did want to give one example. This is the think of the lawyers. I wanted to give one example given the day that's in it. A number of weeks ago, a piece was run in state media in China, which said that there was a vast conspiracy to violate the national security law of China in Hong Kong by a range of individuals. And it had a graphic which involved my client, Jimmy Lai, at the center. And around it, it had a number of individuals. It had Baroness Helena Kennedy, one of my colleagues in Doughty Street, and who was sanctioned last year as a parliamentarian in the UK, as many European parliamentarians also were, for having the audacity to speak out and criticize the issue about the Uyghur and the Chinese. So she was featured there. There was the leader of the Hong Kong bar, who's had to leave Hong Kong, following threats to him for having the audacity to be a lawyer representing peaceful protesters in Hong Kong and running the Hong Kong Human Rights Monitor. And also on that piece was me. And the reason for that was that the argument ran that by the very act of instructing international human rights lawyers to hold China and the Hong Kong authorities to account, I and my client, Jimmy Lai, are both engaged in some form of conspiracy to undermine the security of the Chinese state. Now, this is an extremely worrying development, and it comes against a backdrop of Benedict Rogers from Hong Kong Watch, an NGO based in London, receiving a threat that he'll be extraterritorially prosecuted unless he removes criticism of China from his website in London. So this is a trend that we need to think about. It's no longer the case that states such as Russia and states such as China and Iran and Saudi Arabia are satisfied with doing what they can to quiet their critics within their borders. The long arm of the state is being used, and it's vital that Ireland, that the European Union, and that other states stand up to that and take proactive action to protect individuals from those types of threats. Because otherwise, I'm afraid it's not only an erosion of the rule of law in those states, it's an erosion of the international order. It's an erosion of the international system whereby states can be held to account. So against that backdrop, I wanted to turn very briefly to what Barry said. I agree very strongly with what Barry said about the UK. It's been a very strange time to be an international human rights lawyer in the United Kingdom. And one of the things that I find very difficult is I often find when I am meeting with other states who are holding one of my clients, for example, in arbitrary detention, what I now get said to me on a regular basis is, well, you're based in London, and the UK says it's okay to breach international human rights law for a variety of reasons, because of the doctrine of necessity, because of their own security, and so on. We're just doing the same thing. So the UK's language that it's used in those examples that Barry gave are now being used as a dictator's playbook. They're now being used as a rationale for further undermining of the rule of law and undermining of international human rights standards in many of those countries far away. So there's a direct link between those countries and what's happening there and the very irresponsible language that's being used about the rule of law and international human rights close to home in the UK.
Thanks a million, Keelan. I just want to pick up on one or two points there, but we're coming to the part of the event where I'd like to draw some questions and comments from the floor. I'm also getting them from our online audience via my WhatsApp here. So we'll turn to that in a sec. But you mentioned, you know, those sort of threats and that. You've had lots of threats apart from that because of your human rights work.
Yeah, so I mean, partly goes with the territory, which it shouldn't, but it does. So, you know, for many years, I've been used to getting threats where you're, if I can put it this way, caught in the slipstream of the abuse of your clients. So, you know, for example, when I act in cases involving Saudi Arabia or Iran, you often have to deal with attempts to hack your email, surveillance type issues. I often find, particularly in cases involving women journalists, that I receive quite a lot of abuse, but it's indirect. It's more in the sense that you're acting for this individual, you're acting for Rana Rahimpour from BBC Persian, she's an enemy of the Iranian state, you know, you're also a parasite, that kind of language, or similarly with Maria Ressa. But worryingly, in the last few weeks, I did decide to speak out about this, which was a difficult decision. I've had a physical attack in my chambers in London, where I was probably in the wrong place at the wrong time. So it was targeted at my chambers in general. So a gentleman who was very irate came to chambers, assaulted me at the door. I just happened to be the person who was there, was shouting about a range of individuals who I work with and having a problem with human rights lawyers. And immediately when it happened, I have to say, and he only pushed me, so I wasn't seriously injured or anything, but some of you may have heard about the attack on immigration lawyers in London in 2020, immigration solicitors, Duncan Lewis. So this was a single individual who'd become so irate at the language that was being used. He'd seen media coverage about immigration lawyers and human rights lawyers ensuring that criminals, for example, were allowed to stay in the UK. And he turned up with a knife to Duncan Lewis's offices and stabbed a member of staff and was attempting to murder a partner there because he was so irate by the language that he'd seen. And his trial for terrorism is coming up quite soon. So when you have people using, at a very high political level, including, I'm afraid to say, the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister, when you have them using language like lefty lawyers and talking about irresponsible human rights lawyers, this has real life consequences. It's against a backdrop where they've had a colleague of theirs, an MP, murdered by an individual. So it's very worrying. Now, that was one incident, but it seems ridiculous to be talking about multiple ones. The other one is that I've had just personally an individual targeting me in the last few weeks with photographs of me with targets on top of it, saying you're a human rights lawyer, you should be like Pat Finucane, you should be like others who've been killed, and giving a list of names. But you know,
and you've got to take that seriously.
No, and well, I do. So you know, the police are being good, and the police are supporting it. There's partly an anti-Irish element to that, and I'm afraid there is also a growing trend towards anti-Irish rhetoric in the UK, which a lot of us are seeing at the moment, which I personally think is linked to Brexit and some of the irresponsible language that's been used in relation to Brexit. But I've got to say, the threats that you normally get are targeted at your clients, but those are very real threats in London. And it's not just me, it's happening. As soon as I spoke out about it, I had a very large number of lawyers contact me to say they've had something similar. A number of my colleagues who acted in the Rwanda case and got individuals off the flight have similarly had very abusive material. And what you expect to see is political leaders saying, this is outrageous. This is an attack on the rule of law. This shouldn't be happening to lawyers. And instead you have rhetoric coming at a very high level politically in the UK, which encourages it.
Sobering times. Okay,
Sorry, you told me I was the jokes person.
You're not.
I'm afraid I've let you down.
Yeah. Jeez, you completely misread the brief. I want to turn to the audience. So if anybody has a question or a comment, maybe raise your hand. I don't know if we've got a roving mic. Maybe not. So just speak loudly, and we can hear you. And you might identify yourself before you speak. This gentleman here.
Yeah, if I can, I'm Marius from Lithuania, and I have a question actually. I don't know if really Maria can hear me. One question would be to Maria, and maybe another question here to the panelists. So the question to Maria would be, the question of this discussion, is it possible to live an honest life in this dishonest system? My question would be, is it possible to live the honest life after you leave this dishonest system and come to the honest political system? And my question is about those Russians who came here and who live in the honest political systems, both here in Ireland, but in many other countries. And when we see the war exploding in basically provoked and brought to Ukraine by their own nation, when we go to the streets, to the gatherings, we very rarely would see the people with white and blue and white flags, the washed Russian flags. We very rarely see the people or communities who would go together and organize those gatherings themselves and would say, you know, it's not only the other societies, it's not only Ukrainians, but we as Russians, we also want to say what we really think, because many of them left because they don't agree with the system. So my question to Maria would be, do you think it is honest to expect that people who are coming from dishonest political system would really be publicly honest and say what they think? And here to the panel, if I may, another question. I'm short, okay, I will try to be as short as possible. I mean, what we are seeing in the world, and I think Barry Andrews said very clearly, and I think they mentioned the Freedom House report, which says that in the 16 consecutive years, we see the fall of democracy in the world. And we see the deteriorating situation in the world with human rights, with democracy, with many other things. but it seems that we are still living in the old times when we are quarreling among ourselves, among basically democratic countries on some quite small things, not seeing the big picture. I mean, and just to mention a few things, one small thing is TTIP, you remember, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, where we thought we will bring US and European economies closer together and form like European economic and transatlantic economic NATO. Other transatlantic agreements, we still end in fighting, you know, our own wars. So do you think, or Magnitsky Act, which is still very, very difficult to push through our parliament. So my question will be, I mean, to end that, what in the West we should do to hear this wake-up call? And I mean, we've heard the wake-up call. I mean, in a way, we are united, but what can we do more?
Okay, thanks very much for that. I know, Barry, do you want to make a quick comment on that before you go? Because Barry has another engagement that he's got to rush off to, and we appreciate him coming.
Well, just to appreciate the question, and I think the second part of it is obviously directed to the panel, and you know, we have to be careful not to try to divide conceptually the planet between democracy and autocracy, because unfortunately we have a thing called climate change, which requires the entire globe to come together and not to distinguish between the governmental systems. We need China, we need Russia even for climate change. It's so imminent and urgent that there are some issues that unfortunately we almost have to anonymize for the political system prevalent in each of the countries. But for everything else, particularly the transatlantic issue, we've moved into this new Trade and Technology Council, which works well between the US and the EU. It has a good start, but let's see what happens with the next US presidential election.
Okay, and on that note, I will let Barry escape, and thank you very much for your attendance. Maria, I'm going to go to you with the first part of that question, and I guess it's about, you know, whether those Russians who have left Russia because of the system to which you referred in your contribution, whether they have been vocal enough as a group since the beginning of the war, and perhaps even before that.
Well, there are different Russians that are coming to Europe or, you know, abroad since the start of the war. I mean, most of them, I mean, I can't say for all, but most of them are motivated by, you know, this desire to, you know, to leave the country because they don't see themselves living in that regime with Putin, you know, with this aggression, you know. They have to leave almost, you know, like in protest, you know. So those they're active Russians, they are political opposition, they're human rights defenders, they're journalists, I mean, but there is just also simple people who've been, you know, families been divided because of the war, etc., who just want to escape and find a new place where they can live, you know, with themselves. So a lot of them are very vocal. A lot of them are participating in protest, anti-war protest, anti-Putin protest in European capitals. I mean, I've been part of those gatherings in London. I've seen them in other European cities. So part of them, they are very active. So part of them, you know, prefer to you know, to just you know, adapt to new conditions where they live. They're all very busy trying to sort their visas. They can't open bank accounts in Europe. They can't open bank accounts anywhere. They left their savings in Russia. So they have to find schools for kids. I mean, most of them are very busy with this crisis situations. And that's where our project ARC, we call it the ARC, you know, helps them to, you know, find solutions to those problems. But I would say these people live in protest to Putin's aggression in Ukraine, and therefore, you know, they come here and they expect, or they want to live in democracy. They want to live in Europe because they think that this is a free place and they don't want to go back.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to go back to the audience again. I think there was another few hands up here. Maybe gentleman down there in the middle. Hi.
Yeah, thanks very much. Very interesting to hear the discussion. Thanks very much. Jeremy Wilmshurst from the British Embassy. Just felt it would be remiss not to make a brief response to some of the comment that was made about the UK. Very, very interesting to hear the discussion. I think it would only be fair to say, and we heard a lot about the UK, maybe a word or two in a positive sense about the profound contribution the UK has made in the development and implementation of international law over the years. And actually, we've heard very little about Ukraine, but in the context of Ukraine, the United Kingdom has committed £1 million to supporting the ICC's investigation into alleged war crimes in Ukraine. We've recently made an announcement of a team of legal and police experts to support that investigation. That's just one example of what the UK is doing to try and tackle people who are committing serious human rights and international humanitarian law abuses around the world. And the UK makes a huge contribution across a range of areas in doing that. Secondly, just to respond very briefly on the protocol, and we don't want to have a massive protocol discussion, I'm conscious, but the UK has set out its legal position as to why it considers that the proposed legislation that's currently making its way through Parliament would be legal if it were enacted. Our preference remains a negotiated solution, but the justification is there. And so the UK government completely refutes the notion that it's acting in a way that is breaking international law. That's not our position whatsoever, and we've put the legal justification out there for people to consider. Thank you very much.
Thanks a million for being here, and thanks for your points. Does anybody want to comment on?
Sure. I'm conscious I was one of those engaging in UK bashing, despite being someone based in the UK. And I've got to say, I mean, I work with your colleagues at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in a range of cases around the world, and there's very brilliant people who have had real results in many of the cases that I've worked in. We would never have got Aras Amari, the British Council cultural rights worker out of Iran, without the support of you and your colleagues. And the Foreign Office has, in the UK, has shown real leadership on some issues in recent years, very close to my heart, including leading the Media Freedom Coalition with Canada originally. My criticisms, I can't speak for Barry, were very much focused at political leadership rather than the work that's being done by the FCDO network. And indeed, many of those who Barry spoke about, who stood up and were counted and chose to resign, were individual civil servants like Jonathan Jones, Sir Jonathan Jones, or indeed my colleague Amal Clooney, who resigned from her role as Media Freedom Envoy because she felt she could no longer be associated with a system when there was such criticism of international law. And it's very difficult as an international lawyer to continue in those circumstances. So my comments were certainly very focused at political leadership and not the work which you and your colleagues do that's valuable. We take a different view on international law, it's fair to say, in relation to the position with the protocol, but I perhaps won't go down that particular
I don't think we want
now.
to get. I don't think we want to get too deep into the protocol, but I think it's probably fair to say, and jump in, please. I think it's probably fair to say that it's precisely because of the beacon that the UK has been in relation to international law in many other respects that people are so taken aback by its position. And I know that it's the UK government's position that on this instance it isn't breaking international law. I would question, having had a number of private discussions with people through my work, I would question how deeply that belief is held in some parts of the British government at least. But it is certainly true that on a previous occasion the government was prepared to acknowledge that it was breaking international law. But as I say, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But
could I say two really quick things on that?
Sorry.
The first thing is, I agree with you completely, Pat, in a shock move on this panel. We're all in agreement that, in fact, it is the UK's leadership role, which means it's listened to. And look, we had a similar issue in a different context with what happened with the US a number of years ago, when you had Trump using enemies of the people type language about journalists and talking about the fake news media, for example. It's precisely because of the UK's leadership role on many of these issues that I am finding it thrown back in my face in relation to cases that I act in. So it does have a real impact, in part because of the UK's leadership role and its role within the Commonwealth and so on. So what the UK says on international law, the world pays attention. And I'm afraid when you have language like breaking international law in a specific and limited way, it resonates, and I'm finding it used back to me. The other thing I would say is there was reference a little earlier, and Maria gave an answer about Russians abroad. And I agree with what Maria said about the very, very valuable work which many Russian communities have done abroad. And I see that in my work. But I did want to say, if anyone wants to take a look at a very brilliant report which was published by the Foreign Affairs Committee in the UK Parliament yesterday, chaired by a Conservative MP, Tom Tugendhat. Tom Tugendhat raised a different issue about Russians abroad, and that was a concern that Russian money continues to be used within London. And he used very emotive language describing the failure to crack down on dirty money from Russia in the UK as meaning that the government had a direct link to the UK essentially being a safe deposit box for dirty money for kleptocrats and malign actors internationally. And when we're thinking about Russians abroad, my concern is not about Russian communities abroad, many of whom have done very brilliant work and many of whom have been casting a light on the precise issues that Alexei Navalny is now facing in Russian prisons. I have a real concern with what the UK is doing about coming good on its promise to crack down on dirty money from abroad. That's a huge issue. And read the report.
Sinead.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond as well and echo that I think it is exactly because of the leadership and tradition that the UK has in the human rights space that it is so concerning and worrying to see some of this language that we've referenced. But just in relation to the protocol, our partner bodies, the Equality Commission in Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, just published yesterday or perhaps the day before, their own analysis of the protocol bill with major concerns over even the fact that the articles that relate to us, and we're part of that dedicated mechanism in the all-island dimensions of it, although they are excluded, they're part of the exclusion clauses, it's impossible to untangle in that protocol bill the application to those clauses. So it undermines our role in monitoring the impact of rights and equality. It undermines the UK's commitment to non-diminution of rights across this island, which ultimately threatens the peace of this island. And I think that's where our major concern is as three equality and human rights bodies on this island. So I do think that's an important piece of analysis to read in this discussion.
Okay, thanks, Sinead. I will go to the gentleman down at the back, yeah, and then I'll come over to you.
Thanks, Pat. Simon Nugent is my name. A bit like Jeremy, I also have some discomfort with the focus that Barry was placing on the United Kingdom at the beginning of our discussion. And my question was really for him and for Sinead, but maybe, Pat, you could guess what Barry might reply, given you follow these matters very closely at European Council meetings. And what I noticed was that the Sakharov Prize has almost always been awarded to persons related to polities outside the European Union. And my question is whether or not these issues inside the European Union are just a bit too hot to handle for the Parliament, because not only in Malta, but also in other countries within the European Union, we have issues and questions and a certain amount of contagion in terms of these rights being protected adequately.
And that echoes actually another question that has come in from one of our online viewers about the need for within, precisely as you say, within the European Union, with specific reference, the questioner says, to Poland, and to which one could add Hungary, who have obviously been engaged in long-running battles with the European Commission, battles which I think have been dialed down now in the last 6 months for obvious reasons, but which nonetheless were over very substantive and in many cases concerning issues. But I'm going to stick with the audience for a little bit, and maybe we'll come back and address a couple of the questions that are raised. A lady over here. There's a mic coming. There you go.
First of all, thank you very much to all of the panellists for their individual and very excellent contributions. It's Catherine Cosgrave, a lawyer here in Dublin. And may I particularly just say thank you to Keelan herself for speaking out very recently about the very difficult threats that she has been receiving, and for being very brave in the work that she has done for a very long time. My question was also partly directed at Barry as a
This is
former,
obviously why he left. He was getting all the
Yeah.
difficult questions.
as a parliamentarian, but I note that the contribution from most of the panelists has rightly focused on very extreme situations internationally, and it's very easy in that context to kind of shine a light on very serious human rights abuses. But there's, just to bring the conversation a little closer to home, and Liam Herrick, I don't know if he's attending this afternoon, has a piece in the Irish Examiner just today on death of democracy not necessarily occurring by guillotine, and noting the kind of shrinking civil society spaces here in Ireland, but also the increased tendency of the Irish government to, if we might describe it in this way, hoof important legislation through the Dáil, and an absence of debate on important issues. And perhaps, and Sinéad, you've already touched on it, the increased need for access to justice, for issues to be litigated, the absence of civil legal aid here for important areas. I might mention migration, being self-interested in that area. And if you might just comment on our own process of parliamentary processes here and the manner in which legislation is perhaps not debated in the way that it should be. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, May. I'll take one more question and comment here, and then we'll come back to the audience.
Thanks, Francis Jacobs. Obviously, the subject today has been huge because we're dealing with democratic backsliding in countries which have been traditionally democratic. We're dealing with the problems, obviously, of China and Russia, which are obviously increasingly serious. My question is, how do we best publicize some of the other cases around the world which get neglected? Human rights defenders and others who are not regularly in the news. I know you mentioned the Philippines, for example. We don't hear that much. We know that Duterte, there's been quite a few human rights abuses, and obviously in Brazil now with the murder of in the Amazon jungle and so on. But then there are countries in Africa and Latin America where human rights abuses have been taken, where we hear very, very little in the media. How can we best publicize them? It's always seemed to me that the Sakharov Prize, one of the great values of it, is not only to draw attention to people like Navalny and Mandela and so on, but also to some of the much less familiar human rights abuses around the world.
Yeah, thanks. I'll throw that to you in a sec, Sinead, but just to say, from the perspective of somebody who works in a newspaper, of course, it's a constant struggle to engage people, with stories, important stories of interest. And there's stuff that's in front of people on a day-to-day basis, and much of that would be the sort of stuff that I write about. And of course, you're struggling for attention there as well, not least with Love Island and other such important breaking stories. But I can only speak for my own organisation in the Irish Times, but it's something that we are constantly aware of, and I've no doubt that we could do more in that area. But it's something that we are constantly aware of, and I think of the sort of work that my colleague Sally Hayden has done in shining a light on migration across the Mediterranean, which is an enormous story. Daily a story of death and drowning, and one which really struggles, possibly because it happens all the time. You really struggle to get it onto the broader news agenda. But maybe you want to Sinead, to take up a couple of those points, particularly some of them raised by Catherine.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll leave the second question probably for Caoilfhionn and Maria, but absolutely, Catherine, I'm really glad you raised that. I mean, I think Barry's analogy of like bankruptcy, it happens very gradually and then all of a sudden, I think is so important. And that's what I was trying to do in highlighting what I see as that erosion here and the real risks that we have. I think parliamentary scrutiny, the processes we have within the Dáil are hugely problematic. We are continually and have continually called since 2016 for the establishment of a Human Rights and Equality Committee within the Oireachtas, which would allow for the human rights and equality impact assessment of legislation as it proceeds through the Dáil. That hasn't happened. Unfortunately, the pre-leg scrutiny process is often cursory and poorly held, and sometimes even waived, as we've seen recently with the new MICA legislation. And one of the biggest issues I have is about participation, that within that scrutiny process, within the impact assessment process, we need to see greater voice from those groups who are most impacted by the policy and legislation that's being developed. We see this, for example, in CRPD. Ireland has ratified CRPD, but we've yet to see come to life really the participation that we need to see from people with disabilities for legislation and policy for people with disabilities. And it's a lesson that I have learned most dearly since becoming Chief Commissioner is that mantra of nothing about us without us. Participation is something that we live and breathe in my organisation. We have direct lived experience on the Commission itself, and in everything that we do, we consult with the people who are most affected by these policies. So I think that has to happen. The pandemic, to me, exposed it. And I think that was so clear throughout the pandemic, was that those processes, because they weren't there in the first place, became so much harder to implement during the pushing through of emergency powers, for example. And were it not for organisations like ICCL, we wouldn't have seen those sunset clauses come into emergency powers. So I think that civil society erosion is another huge concern, particularly around that issue of the funding for human rights organisations within it. And I think in our own work around, and your own work, Catherine, in the immigration space, again, it's about the application of rule of law, and that people can expect to be treated equally and have access to the same legal entitlements that they should, whilst they're going about any international protection process or a migration process at all. So I think there's a huge amount of work to be done here in Ireland. Access to justice, as you say, key amongst them, so that people can start to feel that the system is fair for them. And I think that's the thing that we must always recall, is that even if some of these elements are positive for us, they're not positive for every group in Irish society. And without that data that I keep on coming back to, we cannot measure that and therefore cannot change it.
I'm going to throw some of those things to you in a sec, but I want to go to Maria just on that question that was raised about getting attention for the work you're doing and getting the attention of the world focused on what's going on in your country. I mean, clearly there's a huge focus on Russia now, but there wasn't for a long time. And for a long time, I suppose the rest of the world looked the other way, while the erosion of democratic rights and freedoms was proceeding apace in Russia. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I mean, I think the question was about mainly, how do we highlight the human rights abuses and erosion of democracy in today's world? I mean, where everything is measured by the click, the likes and things like this, attention of people to what's happening around the world is quite short. So, in my work, you try to make these cases, very symbolic, like you don't talk about 20 cases, you talk about one Navalny case, and people get the message, you try to, bring news into the world about these cases as much as you can using social media and YouTube channels and video, videos. So you have to be innovative in the way you communicate about these cases. So you bring celebrities, Amal's name was mentioned. I mean, he hugely contributes to the work we all do in the human rights field, because, her face is on the, on the cover of a lot of magazines around the world, and she brings these issues to all of us who read this and who are inspired by her work, and many others. So I think we need more work like this. And unfortunately, it's very difficult. Human rights are, if you look at the cover pages, if you look at our media, human rights are sort of at the bottom. So it's very difficult, whether it's Russia or whether it's, Philippines or Latin America, etc. So I think we just, as communicators or people who work in this space, have to be more innovative and have to dedicate, significant amount of time and effort to communicate these issues for human, for public relations, not just the legal work.
Thanks, Maria. Do you want to pick up on some of those matters to conclude? Because I'm afraid we're right up against time.
Yeah, so I think there've been some really important questions raised there. I think on I think it was Simon's question about the Sakharov Prize being awarded outside the European Union. I think there's a very important point there about the European Union not being complacent about human rights within its own borders. And that's why I gave the Malta example in the way that I did. And you think of Eleanor Roosevelt's very powerful words from 1958 about human rights, international human rights being in small places close to home. And I do often find that there's a tendency for people to assume this is a problem over there. It's a problem far away. And actually, the problems we've been talking about today are problems where I'm based at the moment in London, in the UK, both because of the links between UK-Russia or what the UK is doing to hold other states to account, or indeed, if I may, with someone from the British Embassy here. My client, Jimmy Lai, is a UK citizen and he's languishing in a Hong Kong prison. And on the day that's in it, perhaps I would ask you to return to your capital and ask that the UK government take action in relation to Jimmy Lai. And we do have an outstanding request to meet the Foreign Secretary. We haven't yet had a response as the international legal team for Jimmy Lai. So perhaps I can give you that as an action point for afterwards. But I think there's a really important point about not being complacent and thinking of these as being faraway issues. So I very much agree with that. And I do also think that the European Parliament has shown real leadership on some issues in recent months concerning the use of GSP Plus, the GSP Plus mechanism. So this is a system of trade preferences, which applies to other countries, including the Philippines. And the EU has preferential trade arrangements with the Philippines. And it's on the basis that the Philippines complies with international human rights standards. I've got to say, myself and Amal lead the team for Maria Ressa. It's been quite bizarre and Kafkaesque to see the list of standards which the Philippines supposedly meets at the same time that we've got our client facing a century behind bars simply for doing her job. And I was pleased to see the European Parliament say the European Union External Action Service and other parts of the European Union need to show leadership and need to ensure that they use the economic and trade leverage they've got with other countries to hold them to human rights standards. Final thing just is on the point about how to tell stories. This is a real problem that I have in my international cases, but also domestically, particularly where we're dealing with stories where the person who's the victim of the human rights abuse has to be anonymous. So where we're dealing with gender-based violence, for example, it's incredibly difficult to get the press interested in a story when you don't have a name and a face and a photograph and a human interest story. It's a real challenge. And unfortunately, we often are in a situation where in order to secure real change, you do need to shout from the rooftops and you do need noise and interest to put pressure on those who ultimately are the lawmakers and can make change. So it's a real challenge that we have. Of course, sometimes in cases, there's a reason to be quiet strategically at a particular time. It's not always a shout from the rooftops rule, but there is a real difficulty about that. And we've tried to be more creative in how we can raise it. I wanted to give one example of that. There was a lonely cartoonist mentioned earlier, the very start of this event. I acted for a cartoonist called Raymond Abale a number of years ago, who was detained in Equatorial Guinea simply for being a satirical cartoonist. And Equatorial Guinea is not very responsive to the United Nations human rights mechanisms, but it is very responsive to pressure from the US and to commercial pressure from companies which are based there. So we did a combination of two things. We tried to get a quick fire decision from the UN Human Rights Council special procedures to say that there'd been a gross violation of his rights, which we secured. And then we used that to try to get interest within the US to put pressure on the regime. But also we got great support from US senators who wrote to the companies who were investing in Equatorial Guinea to say, here's the regime that you're propping up, and threatened to call them out if they didn't take action. But we also got the organisation I was dealing with, Cartoonist Rights Network International, got a whole series of editorial cartoonists to do just images showing Raymond Abale behind bars and to get a Twitter storm going with these brilliant images. And that's a really good example of solidarity from cartoonists to back up this cartoonist who was under pressure and to use that to make noise, to shine a spotlight on his case, and ultimately to secure change and get him out. So that's an example of law was one strand, but you're not dealing with a country that's rule of law compliant. You've got to use the mechanisms that you can, including trying to get press attention. But we did that through use of these brilliant editorial cartoonists. So there's ways you can do it sometimes, but it is a real challenge.
By whatever means necessary.
Yeah.
We've run out of time. I'm afraid. Can I thank you all for coming along and for your participation? Can I thank the European Parliament office for organising this event today. But especially can I thank our panellists, the lately departed Barry Andrews, Maria, who has joined us from London, Sinéad, who has come all the way from Dunleary, I think, and Keelan, who has also come from London. So on your behalf, could I thank them, and perhaps we should give them a round of applause. That's great. Thanks, guys.